You look like my grandma in heaven.
On a fog-covered Golden Gate Bridge, a 68-year-old woman stands on the edge, ready to end everything after being branded a thief by the world she once built. Behind her, an 8-year-old girl selling chocolate bars speaks words that break through the fog and pull her back from the silence of despair. In that fragile space between falling and staying, death and a second chance, a melted chocolate bar becomes the thread that ties a fallen billionaire to a child who carries the secret that could destroy them both or set them free. Welcome to Story Theater. Take your seat, silence your phones and get ready to enjoy the story. The fog rolled in thick and gray over San Francisco Bay, swallowing the Golden Gate Bridge in its cold embrace. At 68 years old, Margaret Harrison stood alone on the pedestrian walkway, her fingers wrapped around the icy steel railing. The metal bit into her palms, but she barely felt it anymore. Nothing seemed to penetrate the numbness that had settled into her bones. Over the past 6 months, she had once been celebrated as the visionary, founder of Streammind Technologies, a woman whose name appeared on magazine covers and keynote stages around the world. Now those same publications ran headlines that burned like acid: the tech queen, who lost her mind. They called her a thief, a fraud, a senile old woman who had embezzled billions from her own company before losing track of reality itself. But Margaret knew the truth that no one would believe. David Collins, her trusted chief financial officer, had forged her signature on documents she had never seen, transferred funds to accounts she had never opened, and vanished into thin air, with a fortune that should have changed thousands of lives. The wind whipped strands of gray hair across her face, as she looked down at the churning black water below. How easy it would be to let go, to simply stop fighting, a world that had already convicted her without trial. Her hands trembled as she gripped the top rail, preparing to lift herself up and over. Behind her, a small voice pierced through the roar of wind and ocean. "You look like my grandma in heaven." Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly to find a little girl standing on the walkway, no more than 8 years old, with dark eyes that held impossible wisdom. The child wore a thin jacket over her dress, and clutched a cardboard box filled with chocolate bars. "What did you say?" Margaret's voice came out hoarse, barely audible. The girl stepped closer, completely unafraid, and held out a melted chocolate bar wrapped in foil. "My grandma. She had sad eyes like yours before she went to heaven. Are you going there too?" Something inside Margaret's chest cracked open. She stared at the child's outstretched hand, at the cheap chocolate that had melted and reformed in its wrapper, at the small fingers offering it without hesitation. Her vision blurred with tears she had thought were long dried up. "I don't know," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know where I'm going anymore." The girl nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Mama told me our lives aren't just for us. She said we have to stay for the people who need us, even when it hurts." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and she stepped down from the railing, her whole body shaking. She sank to her knees on the cold concrete, and the girl gently pressed the chocolate bar into her hand. Margaret clutched it like a lifeline, sobbing openly now, all pretense of dignity abandoned. They stayed there together as the fog swirled around them, an image of lost innocence beside broken grace. When Margaret finally looked up again, wiping tears from her weathered cheeks, the girl smiled at her. "What's your name?" Margaret asked. "Sophie Allen. I have to go now. My aunt is waiting." The child turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "Keep the chocolate. It's not much, but maybe it'll help you remember sweetness exists." Then Sophie disappeared into the fog, her small form swallowed by the mist, leaving Margaret alone on the bridge, with a melted chocolate bar and something she had not felt in months. Something dangerous and fragile and terrifyingly real: the faint, flickering desire to matter again, to fight back, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Margaret rose slowly to her feet, tucking the chocolate into her coat pocket. She turned away from the railing and began walking back toward the city, each step heavy with purpose she did not yet understand but could no longer deny. Margaret walked slowly away from the bridge, her hand pressed against the chocolate bar in her coat pocket. The foil wrapper crinkled beneath her trembling fingers, anchoring her to the present moment. She could still hear Sophie's voice echoing in her mind. "Mama told me our lives aren't just for us." The fog had begun to lift as she made her way down the pedestrian path, revealing glimpses of the city below. San Francisco sprawled before her in layers of light and shadow, a place that had once felt like home but now seemed foreign. Everything familiar had become strange, every certainty dissolved into doubt. Yet somehow, a small girl selling chocolate bars on a bridge had reached through that fog and pulled her back from the edge. Margaret found a bench overlooking the bay and sat down heavily, her legs giving out from the adrenaline that had sustained her. She pulled the chocolate bar from her pocket and held it in both hands, studying it as if it were a sacred object. The foil had torn at one corner, revealing where the chocolate inside had melted, and reformed into an uneven surface that bore no resemblance to its original shape. It was imperfect, damaged, reshaped by circumstances beyond its control, just like her. She unwrapped it slowly, the foil peeling away to reveal misshapen chocolate beneath. The sweet smell hit her immediately, triggering a memory so sharp it made her breath catch. She was 7 years old again, in her grandmother's kitchen in Portland, watching the old woman melt chocolate on the stove. "Why do you always make it from scratch, Grandma?" young Margaret had asked. "The store-bought kind is easier." Her grandmother had smiled, that knowing expression that seemed to hold all the wisdom of her 72 years. "Because easy things don't teach us anything worth knowing, sweetheart. When you make something with your own hands, you put a piece of your soul into it. That's what makes it matter." The memory faded, leaving Margaret alone on the bench with tears streaming down her weathered face. She broke off a piece of the chocolate and placed it on her tongue, letting it melt slowly. The sweetness spread through her mouth, and for the first time in 6 months, she tasted something other than bitterness and ash. It was just cheap chocolate, probably purchased in bulk. But in that moment it carried the weight of everything she had lost and everything she might still become. A thought crystallized in her mind: Sophie had not appeared on that bridge by accident. The girl had chosen to speak to a stranger teetering on the edge. She had offered chocolate and wisdom, not hoping for anything in return, but because her mother had taught her that lives are meant to be shared. Margaret wrapped the remaining chocolate carefully, tucking it back into her pocket. The wrapper crinkled again, now transformed into something like a promise. She stood up from the bench, her body still aching, but something had shifted inside her chest. It was not hope, not yet, but the memory of what hope had once felt like. The city lights reflected off the water as darkness settled. Margaret turned away from the ocean and began walking toward the streets below, each step carrying her further from the bridge. She clutched that chocolate wrapper like a talisman, like proof that somewhere in this world, an 8-year-old girl named Sophie Allen still believed that sweetness exists and that lives are worth living, even the broken ones. Golden Gate Park became Margaret's sanctuary and her prison. At night, when tourists vanished and fog rolled in thick enough to hide her shame, she would spread newspapers beneath eucalyptus trees and try to remember what sleep without fear felt like. The chocolate wrapper stayed folded in her coat pocket, growing softer with each passing day. She could not throw it away. It was her only proof that Sophie Allen existed, that their encounter had been real. 3 weeks into homelessness, Margaret met Ruth Campbell at the soup kitchen near Haight Street. Ruth was a retired nurse in her mid-70s with hands that still moved with medical precision as she ladled chicken broth into cups. Her silver hair was pulled back tight, and her eyes held the steady compassion that comes from witnessing humans suffering without turning away. "First time here?" Ruth asked, handing Margaret a cup of soup that steamed in the cold evening air. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. The kindness in Ruth's voice felt like a physical blow after weeks of being invisible. "It gets easier," Ruth said quietly. "Not better, but easier. You learn to carry it." That night, Margaret also met Jimmy, a man who had survived the streets for 6 years. He was in his early 50s, but the streets had aged him beyond time. His beard was long and matted, his clothes layered, but his eyes still held defiant humor. "The trick is finding good cardboard," Jimmy told her as they sat on a park bench, sharing crackers Ruth had given him. "And never sleeping in the same spot twice. Patterns make you vulnerable." Margaret absorbed his lessons in survival. She learned which bathrooms stayed unlocked at night, where to find day-old bread, how to recognize which police would leave you alone. Through Jimmy and Ruth, she rediscovered humility and the silent dignity of people who chose to survive despite having every reason to give up. Then one afternoon, sitting in a diner nursing a single cup of coffee stretched across 2 hours, Margaret looked up at the television and felt her body go rigid. David Collins filled the screen, his handsome face composed as he spoke to a reporter. He wore an expensive Italian suit, his hair perfectly styled, radiating the confidence of a man who had stolen everything and gotten away with it. Margaret was losing her memory toward the end, David said smoothly. "We all tried to help her, but she became increasingly paranoid, irrational. It breaks my heart to see what she's become." Margaret's hands clenched around her coffee cup until her knuckles turned white. Her jaw tightened until her teeth ached, every muscle coiling with rage so pure it felt like fire. He sat there in his stolen suit, spending her stolen fortune, telling lies with the ease of someone who had never faced consequences. And the world believed him. The world always believed men like David Collins. She set down exact change and walked out into the fading light. The chocolate wrapper crinkled in her pocket, reminding her of Sophie's words, "Our lives aren't just for us." Something hardened in Margaret's chest, crystallizing into resolve as sharp and cold as broken glass. She had been running, hiding, surviving. But survival was no longer enough. It was time to fight back. The community shelter on Mission Street smelled of industrial detergent and desperation. Margaret arrived early for dinner service, before lines stretched around the block. She moved through the crowded room with her tray, eyes down, trying to make herself small. Then she heard it. A child's laughter, bright and unmistakable, cutting through the dull roar like a bell in darkness. Margaret's head snapped up, her heart hammering. Across the room, near the serving line, Sophie Allen stood holding her aunt's hand. When their gazes met, Sophie's face broke into a smile of pure recognition. "It's you," Sophie called out, pulling her aunt toward Margaret's table. "The lady from the bridge." Lisa Allen looked exhausted beyond physical tiredness. She was perhaps 35 years old, with Sophie's same dark eyes but without the child's light. Her waitress uniform was wrinkled beneath a thin jacket, and she moved with the mechanical precision of someone running on empty. "Sophie, don't bother people," Lisa said wearily. "She's not bothering me," Margaret replied. Sophie climbed onto the bench beside her, chattering about school and sea lions, while Lisa sank onto the opposite bench as if her legs had given up. They talked quietly while Sophie ate. Lisa had been Sophie's mother's younger sister. When her sister died 2 years ago, Lisa had taken Sophie in, working double shifts at 3 restaurants to keep them afloat. The weight of that sacrifice showed in every line of her face. Halfway through the meal, Lisa's face went pale. She set down her fork carefully, then her eyes rolled back and she collapsed sideways, her body folding like paper. The shelter erupted into controlled chaos. Margaret caught Lisa before she hit the floor while someone shouted for help and Sophie began to cry. A volunteer with medical training checked Lisa's pulse and breathing. Exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition. They moved Lisa to a cot in the back room. Margaret stayed with Sophie, holding the frightened child while volunteers worked to stabilize her aunt. Hours passed in that strange suspended time that exists only in emergencies. Later, when Lisa was sleeping under borrowed blankets, Margaret helped Sophie gather their belongings. Lisa's worn canvas bag had fallen open, spilling its contents. Among scattered receipts, Margaret found a small leather journal filled with cramped, urgent handwriting. She should not have looked, but something called to her. Duplicate ledgers, offshore accounts, wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. A list of dates and amounts that matched exactly with the theft that destroyed her life. The final entry was dated 3 weeks before Sophie's mother died. "If something happens to me, look under our bench at Pier 39. I'm sorry. Tell Sophie I loved her more than anything." Margaret's hands trembled as she closed the journal. Sophie's mother had known David Collins, had worked with him, had helped him steal Margaret's fortune and then paid for that choice with her life. This child, this innocent girl who had saved her life on the bridge, carried the blood debt of Margaret's destruction. And yet Sophie herself was blameless, a victim of adult sins she could never have prevented or understood. Margaret looked at the sleeping child curled in a chair beside her aunt's cot, and felt her heart crack open. With a terrible mixture of grief and love and the crushing burden of truth, dawn broke cold and gray over San Francisco Bay as Margaret and Sophie walked hand in hand toward Pier 39. Lisa was still recovering at the shelter, and Margaret had promised to take Sophie somewhere special. The child skipped beside her, pointing at seagulls and joggers, unaware of the weight, pressing down on Margaret's chest with every step closer to the waterfront. The pier was nearly empty at this hour, just a few fishermen and the barking chorus of sea lions on the floating docks. Margaret led Sophie past closed gift shops and the silent carousel, her eyes scanning the rows of weathered benches. She had no idea which bench Sophie's mother had meant, but something told her she would recognize it. "Mama used to bring me here," Sophie said suddenly. "We had a favorite spot where we could see all the sea lions. That one, right there." She pointed to a bench near the edge, its green paint peeling from years of salt spray. Margaret's heart raced as they approached. She knelt on the damp planks, running her fingers along the underside of the bench, feeling for anything unusual. Her fingertips brushed against something hard and cold. Duct tape, securing something flat against the wood. Margaret's breath caught as she worked the tape free until a small rusted tin box came loose in her hands. "What is it?" Sophie asked, leaning closer with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. "Something your mama left here," Margaret said softly. "Something important." Her hands shook as she pried open the tin. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a USB drive. Beneath it, folded tight, was paper covered in that same shaky handwriting. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning words that would change everything. David forged Margaret Harrison's signature on every transfer document. I helped him hide the money in offshore accounts because he said we were protecting the company. I believed him. By the time I realized what we had really done, it was too late. He said if I went to the police, I would lose Sophie. So I stayed quiet and helped destroy an innocent woman's life. I'm sorry. This drive has copies of everything. The real ledgers, the wire transfers, the shell companies. Margaret Harrison was innocent. The confession was signed by Elena Allen, who had known she was running out of time. Sophie's mother had carried this terrible knowledge to her grave, had died knowing she had helped destroy Margaret while trying to protect her daughter. Margaret sat back, the USB drive in one hand and the confession in the other. Tears streamed down her face, not joy but something more complicated. This was the proof that could restore her name. But it came wrapped in tragedy, sealed with Sophie's mother's death, paid for with suffering. Sophie watched her with those knowing eyes, and Margaret realized the child understood more than anyone had credited her. She had lost her mother to David Collins just as Margaret had lost everything. They were bound now by trauma and survival. Can we feed the sea lions now? Sophie asked quietly. Like Mama used to do. Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded, slipping the evidence into her coat pocket alongside the chocolate wrapper. She bought dried fish from a vendor just opening, and together they stood at the railing, watching the sea lions bark and play. For a few precious minutes, they were just a woman and a child feeding animals at dawn, pretending the world was simple and truth did not demand such an unbearable price. Margaret sat in a coffee shop on Market Street, the USB drive burning in her pocket while Sophie colored pictures at a corner table. The evidence was right there. One phone call to the police and this nightmare would be over. David Collins would be arrested, her name cleared, justice served. But the moment Margaret imagined making that call, all she could see was Sophie's face when the child learned the truth about what her mother had done. The weight pressed down on Margaret's shoulders until she could barely breathe. Exposing David meant exposing Elena Allen, dragging Sophie's mother's name through the same mud that had buried Margaret's reputation. The child had already lost so much. Did she deserve to lose her mother's memory too? Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled until she found Jennifer Walsh. They had met decades ago when Jennifer was a journalism student and Margaret had been her mentor. If anyone could help navigate this situation, it was Jennifer. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon. Margaret left Sophie with Ruth and made her way downtown with the USB drive hidden in her coat. Jennifer's office was chaotic stacks of papers, walls covered in clippings. Jennifer herself had aged well, her hair streaked with silver but her eyes still sharp. Margaret Harrison, Jennifer said softly. I wasn't sure you'd ever contact me again. I need your help, Margaret replied. But what I'm about to show you could put a child in danger. She laid out everything. The USB drive, Elena's confession, the connection to Sophie. Jennifer listened in silence, her mind already working through the implications. This clears your name completely, Jennifer finally said. But you're right about the child. If we go public with Elena's involvement, Sophie becomes the daughter of an accomplice. The media will destroy her childhood. Then I'll make the ghosts speak, Margaret said, her jaw tightening. We leak the evidence strategically. We focus on David's forgeries, his offshore accounts, his manipulation of Elena. We paint her as another victim, which is what she was. We protect Sophie's mother's memory while exposing the truth. Jennifer studied Margaret with admiration. You know this means you won't get full vindication. Some people will still doubt you. I don't care about full vindication anymore, Margaret replied, realizing it was true. I care about that little girl having a chance at a normal life. She saved me on that bridge, Jennifer. I won't repay that by destroying the only thing she has left of her mother. Jennifer nodded slowly, then reached for her laptop. Then we do this carefully. We build the case against David piece by piece. We make Elena a footnote, a woman who was coerced and threatened. It won't be easy, and it won't be fast. But it's the right thing to do. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, tension she had carried since finding that journal. This was not the vindication she had dreamed of during those nights in the park. But it was something better. Protection for an innocent child. Mercy wrapped in justice. Thank you, Margaret whispered. Don't thank me yet, Jennifer replied. We're about to make a very powerful man very angry. Are you ready for that fight? Margaret thought of Sophie's smile, of the chocolate wrapper in her pocket, of the choice that little girl had made to speak to a stranger on a bridge. I've been ready for months. Let's bring him down. Jennifer's article hit the front page on a Tuesday morning, and by noon the city was talking about Margaret Harrison. The headline read, "New evidence in Harrison case raises questions of fraud and cover-up." Jennifer had laid out the case with precision, using Elena's documents to paint a devastating picture of David Collins's manipulation. Margaret stood outside a newsstand, staring at her photograph on the front page. It was an old picture from her Streamline days, back when she had worn expensive suits and smiled with easy confidence. That woman felt like a stranger now. By afternoon, the story had spread. Cable news picked it up, legal experts weighed in, and social media erupted demanding justice. The narrative that had condemned Margaret began to crack. She became the wronged grandmother, the entrepreneur destroyed by a trusted colleague. Public opinion started to shift. The FBI reopened the case within 24 hours. Federal agents descended on David's vineyard before dawn. Margaret watched the news coverage from Ruth's apartment, her hands shaking as she saw David's face flash across the screen, cornered, his facade crumbling. For 3 days, Margaret believed justice was within reach. She met with FBI agents, provided Elena's evidence. They treated her with respect, calling her Mrs. Harrison. Sophie stayed with her, a constant reminder of why Margaret had chosen mercy over complete vindication. Then on Thursday afternoon, Lisa called from the shelter, her voice shaking with fear. "Sophie's gone," Lisa said, barely able to speak through her tears. "I came back from my shift and the apartment was empty. There's a note on the counter." Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of Ruth's kitchen table, her knuckles white, her vision narrowing to a single point of terrible clarity. "What does the note say?" "Uncle David is taking care of me," Lisa read, her voice breaking. "That's all it says." "Margaret, I never told Sophie about David. She doesn't have an uncle. He took her." The phone slipped from Margaret's hand, clattering against the floor. The room spun as all the progress they had made collapsed into a single horrifying reality. David Collins had taken Sophie. He had stolen the one thing Margaret cared about more than vindication, more than justice. The little girl who had saved her life was now in the hands of a desperate man. Margaret picked up the phone, her voice steady despite the terror. "Call the FBI. Tell them everything. I'm going to find her." She hung up before Lisa could respond, her mind racing. David would not hurt Sophie, not yet. The child was leverage, insurance. But David had miscalculated. He thought Margaret would back down. He did not understand that threatening Sophie had transformed her careful strategy into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose. Margaret grabbed her coat and headed for the door, her jaw set in absolute determination. Jennifer had her number. The FBI knew where to find her. But Sophie did not have time for careful procedures and proper channels. She needed someone who would walk through fire to bring her home. And Margaret Harrison, who had once stood on a bridge ready to die, was now more alive than she had been in years, fueled by love and rage and the unshakable certainty that she would not let that little girl down. Margaret had only one lead. David Collins owned a vineyard in Napa Valley, a 40-acre estate purchased with stolen money. She had seen photographs in a magazine profile. The drive north took 2 hours. Margaret gripped the steering wheel of Ruth's borrowed Honda with white-knuckled intensity, her mind cycling through scenarios. Sophie was 8 years old, small and trusting, unprepared for David. The thought made Margaret's chest tighten, but she forced herself to stay focused. The vineyard appeared as the sun descended, casting long shadows across grapevines. The main house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, modern glass and steel. Margaret parked at the edge and approached on foot, her body tense. She found Sophie in a ground-floor room visible through windows. The child sat in a chair too large for her, her face pale but composed, hands folded with unnatural stillness. Relief and rage flooded through Margaret, but before she could reach the window, a voice stopped her. "I knew you would come," David said, stepping from the porch shadow. He held a gun, not pointed at Margaret but present. "You always were predictable, Margaret." Margaret turned slowly, her hands visible and empty, her expression carved from stone. David looked exactly as she remembered from television, handsome in that generic way. But up close, she could see the cracks, the tremor in his jaw, the way he held the gun too tightly. "You stole my life," he said, his voice rising. "I built that company while you took credit. I deserved that money." Margaret stood perfectly still, her voice carrying the weight of months spent surviving on the streets. "No, you stole your own soul." The words landed with unexpected force. David's hand wavered, his composure cracking before he recovered. Margaret saw the truth of him then, not a criminal mastermind but a small man who had convinced himself that theft was justice. Sirens echoed through the valley, distant but growing closer. David's head snapped toward the sound, his face contorting with panic. Jennifer had traced Margaret's call. The FBI had followed. Help was coming, but not here yet. Let the child go, Margaret said quietly, taking one step forward. Whatever happens to me, let Sophie walk away. She's innocent. David's laugh was hollow. Innocent? Her mother helped me destroy you. There's no innocent in this story. But before he could continue, the air filled with the sound of vehicles on gravel, of doors slamming and voices shouting commands. Federal agents emerged from behind the buildings, weapons drawn, surrounding David with professional efficiency. He froze, the gun useless now, his empire collapsing around him. Margaret did not watch his arrest. She ran to the window where Sophie sat, and the moment their eyes met through the glass, the child began to cry. Margaret found the door and burst through, gathering Sophie into her arms as the little girl sobbed against her shoulder, both of them shaking with relief and trauma and the overwhelming knowledge that they had survived something terrible together. David Collins was led away in handcuffs, still protesting, still trying to rewrite the narrative. But Margaret did not care about his words anymore. She held Sophie close and whispered promises into the child's hair, promises that they would be safe now, that the nightmare was over, that love had proven stronger than fear. Months later, Margaret Harrison stood in a downtown law office, watching her attorney sign the final documents that officially cleared her name. The evidence from Elena's USB drive, combined with the FBI's investigation, had proven beyond doubt that David Collins orchestrated the entire fraud. The forged signatures, the offshore accounts, the carefully constructed web of lies that destroyed Margaret's reputation, all of it had been dismantled piece by piece in a federal courtroom, where David sat in an orange jumpsuit and listened to his empire crumble. The media that once mocked her now scrambled to interview her, to apologize, to rewrite their narratives with breathless enthusiasm. But Margaret declined every request. She had no interest in returning to the spotlight, in rebuilding the public persona that once defined her existence. That version of Margaret Harrison felt like someone from a previous life. Someone who had not yet learned that the most important work happens in quiet spaces between public recognition and private redemption. The settlement from Streamline Technologies was substantial. She could have reclaimed her position, started another company, returned to the world of venture capital and board meetings. Instead, Margaret used the money to establish the Second Chances Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women over 60 restart their lives after devastating losses. The foundation provided job training, housing assistance, legal support, and most importantly, the kind of dignity that comes from being seen and valued. Ruth Campbell became the foundation's first board member, bringing her nursing experience and understanding of what it meant to survive with grace. Jimmy found work as outreach coordinator, using his 6 years of homelessness to connect with people who had learned to distrust every offered hand. Together, they built something that measured success not in market valuations, but in the number of women who learned to hope again, to believe their lives still mattered. Sophie lived with Margaret now, the foster care paperwork finalized after months of home visits and background checks. Lisa had signed over custody voluntarily, recognizing that Margaret could provide the stability Sophie deserved. Lisa visited often, and Margaret made sure Sophie understood she had not lost her aunt but gained a larger family. They lived in a modest house in the Sunset District, nothing like Margaret's old mansion but warm and filled with comfortable chaos. Sophie had her own room, painted pale yellow with stars on the ceiling that glowed in the dark. Margaret taught her to cook simple meals, to manage money, to ask questions about the world. In the evenings, they would sit together and read, or talk about Sophie's day, or simply exist in companionable silence, while the fog rolled in through the Golden Gate. Yet some nights, when Sophie was asleep and the house was quiet, Margaret still dreamed of the bridge. She would wake with her heart racing, her hands gripping the sheets. Her mind caught in that moment when she had stood on the railing and looked down at the black water. But then she would walk to Sophie's room and stand in the doorway, watching the child breathe in the soft glow of those artificial stars. And she would remember that falling was never the only option. That sometimes salvation came in the form of a melted chocolate bar and a small voice saying our lives aren't just for us. 6 months later, Margaret and Sophie returned to the Golden Gate Bridge. They arrived just as dawn broke across San Francisco Bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The same fog that had wrapped around her on that terrible night now glowed with morning light, transformed from a shroud into something that looked almost like hope. Margaret stood at the exact spot where she had climbed the railing, her hand resting on the cold steel. The metal was the same beneath her palm, but everything else had changed. She was no longer that woman who believed death was the only escape. That woman had died on this bridge, but not in the way she had intended. She had been resurrected by a child selling chocolate bars, rebuilt through the dignity of survival. Sophie ran ahead along the pedestrian walkway, her jacket bright red against the gray morning, her laughter echoing off the bridge cables. The child moved with fearless energy, chosen joy radiating from her small frame. "Come look, Margaret," Sophie called out, leaning over the railing to watch a boat pass beneath them. The sailboat has a rainbow flag. Margaret walked to join her, moving slowly, letting herself feel the weight of this moment. She placed her hand on Sophie's shoulder, anchoring both of them to this spot. Below them, the water that had once looked like an ending now reflected the sunrise, turning from black to gold as light touched its surface. A breeze lifted through the bridge cables, creating that low musical hum that everyone in San Francisco knew by heart. Margaret closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. Remembering the last time she had stood here, remembering the chocolate wrapper Sophie had pressed into her hand. She still had that wrapper, kept in a small box alongside the photograph of Sophie's mother and the final page of Elena's confession. A crumpled chocolate wrapper lifted from Margaret's pocket, caught by the wind. She watched it tumble through the air, spinning and dancing, finally sailing over the railing and disappearing into the golden light below. For a moment, panic seized her chest. But then Sophie squeezed her hand and smiled up at her with those dark, knowing eyes, and Margaret understood that she did not need the wrapper anymore, because the proof was standing beside her. "What are you thinking about?" Sophie asked, her voice carrying that particular quality of wisdom that emerged when she sensed Margaret drifting into memory. Margaret knelt down so they were eye to eye, her hands resting on Sophie's small shoulders, her voice steady and sure. "I'm thinking about how love outlives us, sweetheart. That's the only fortune worth keeping." Sophie considered this with seriousness, then nodded as if Margaret had confirmed something she already knew. They stood together in the growing light, watching the city wake up around them, watching the fog burn away to reveal the bay and the hills and all the possibilities that existed on the other side of despair. The bridge held them both now, not as a threat but as a witness, a place where Margaret had learned that falling was never the only option, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change everything, could transform the ending into a beginning, could prove that our lives are never just for ourselves. Sometimes life takes us to the edge, only so we can learn how to walk back stronger. Margaret found her second chance not in wealth, but in love. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who's been through their own storm. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your story of resilience, forgiveness, or new beginnings. And remember, no matter the age, every dawn is another chance to begin again. Thank you for watching. This has been Story Theater.